A Russian fighter jet and a US military drone have collided over the Black Sea. American military officials are saying that the incident happened in international airspace, but each side has a different explanation as to what happened and who is to blame for it. It's not uncommon for US and Russian aircraft to interact, shall we say, in that region at the moment, but how significant could this collision be? The Pentagon has given a news conference. Here's Brigadier General Patrick Ryder.
Two Russian Su-27 aircraft conducted unsafe and unprofessional intercept with a U.S. Air Force intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance unmanned MQ-9 aircraft that was operating within international airspace over the Black Sea today. To recap, at approximately 7:03 a.m. Central European Time, one of the Russian Su-27 aircraft struck the propeller of the MQ-9, causing U.S. forces to have to bring the MQ-9 down in international waters. Several times before the collision, the Su-27s dumped fuel on and flew in front of the MQ-9 in a reckless and unprofessional manner. This incident demonstrates a lack of competence in addition to being unsafe and unprofessional.
Well, there are no casualties. Russia does say that it didn't cause the crash. In a statement, it said that its jets set out to identify the US drone, but didn't come into contact with it. The drone, they say, came down because of what Moscow's calling sharp manoeuvring. We'll hear from Washington, D.C. and from Moscow shortly. First, though, what do we know, given two different versions of the same event? Shashank Joshi is defence editor of The Economist.
Well, it's fairly straightforward in the US account. We know that there was a MQ-9 drone over the Black Sea. The MQ-9 is sometimes called the Reaper. It's a very sizable drone. You know, people shouldn't be thinking of small quadcopters here. It's a proper fixed-wing aircraft that's very, very substantially sized and needs a big runway. It was collecting intelligence, presumably on Russian forces in Ukraine, as it has done many, many times over the last year. And it was being tailed by Russian jets, Sukhoi 27s, for about 30 to 40 minutes. And at some point, those two aircraft, I think it was 7 o'clock Central European time, so in the morning, intercepted the aircraft. That's very common. In other words, they go up to it and see what it's doing. However, went beyond that, and according to the US account, they dumped fuel in front of it, which would obviously be a very potentially dangerous maneuver, and they flew in front of it, which obviously would be very disruptive. And at some point, they seem to have collided. The Russians deny it, but I have to say, given what we know generally about US statements versus Russian statements of these kind in this war, particularly, I'm more inclined to believe that the US statement's true and correct and accurate, and that the Russian statement is probably incorrect, as they try and figure out their story as to why they were intercepting this drone in a dangerous way.
Yes, the Americans are calling this reckless, environmentally unsound and unprofessional, and you talk there about the dumping of fuel, which is a line we picked up here as well. What would have been the purpose of that?
I think it would have been to disrupt the flight. Interceptions are very, very common. You know, when Russia sends bombers near North America or near the United Kingdom or Northern Europe, NATO sends intercepting jets to go and track them to make sure that they are not entering airspace, to go check on them, watch them, monitor them. And Russia does the same thing. What isn't common, what's more aggressive, is to try and disrupt a flight. We've seen this with the Chinese Air Force do this in the South China Sea. For example, last year we saw cases in which they dropped chaff. They released chaff in front of an Australian aircraft. And sometimes accidents happen. We've seen last year the Russian Air Force accidentally released a missile in the vicinity of a crewed British surveillance plane over the Black Sea. And that was judged to be an accident. But I think if you're dropping fuel and you're maneuvering in front of a drone like this, that's intentional. And I would suggest the aim would be to try and prevent it from completing its flight, prevent it from gathering intelligence, and to try and raise the risk so that countries like the United States are deterred from conducting further flights in the region, and they have less visibility into the Russian military operational picture in Ukraine, particularly as we enter the period in which Ukraine is preparing for an offensive on the ground.
Given the obvious tensions already between the United States and Russia, presumably both sides are going to want to be careful about things escalating needlessly. But how serious could this become?
I don't think too seriously, and I think that in a way that's partly why Russia may have been more aggressive towards this aircraft, precisely because it was a drone. It did not have a pilot or a crew on board, and they would have known that. And so they might be much more cautious around crewed aircraft, where they know that if they are jeopardizing the lives of US pilots and crew members, that could be a much more seriously politically sensitive and escalatory action. But if it's a drone, they know they can get away with it. And we've seen other countries do this. We saw China, for example, actually actually pick up and seize a US naval drone a couple of years ago in international waters. You would never, detain a warship in international waters, but you can get away with doing it to a drone because the escalation risks are considerably less. But I think, this will provoke concern. There's no way the US is going to stop flying these flights into the Black Sea, where already we've seen naval activity has been sharply curtailed because Turkey's government has not allowed foreign countries to send warships into the Black Sea. So I think this will probably not result in serious escalation, but I do think the US will be eager to show it is going to continue to send these surveillance flights into the region.
Defence editor of The Economist, Shashank Joshi there. Well, the BBC's Gary O'Donoghue is in Washington, D.C., so what's the view there? Is this being seen as a hostile act or as a mistake?
I think it's pretty clear from what the Pentagon's been saying that they don't regard it as a mistake. Bear in mind, they've told us today that this incident went on for 30 or 40 minutes. This wasn't a kind of momentary lapse of concentration or a pilot sort of accidentally bumping into another piece of hardware. This went on for a while, and as you've been hearing, there wasn't just the final contact with the drone, which made the Americans bring it down into the sea, but there was the dumping of fuel, the flying in front, etc., trying to disrupt things. So I think they see it as deliberate. They call it irresponsible, unprofessional, they say, and they're pretty unhappy about it in the sense that they've called in the Russian ambassador for a consultation this afternoon, and that's one of those kind of, in the diplomatic dance, that's one of the things people do when they're very upset about something.
The US is increasingly using unmanned drones for military purposes, isn't it? And I don't know if you heard Shashank Joshi there saying the fact that this aircraft was not manned may have allowed the Russian pilots to feel OK about perhaps being more aggressive towards it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you've seen other countries take pot shots at US drones. The Iranians did it in the Middle East at some US drones. So the stakes are lower, clearly, when there isn't a pilot on board and there isn't any potential for loss of life. You're talking about a piece of hardware, albeit pieces of hardware that cost millions and millions of dollars. But it does allow you to escalate to some degree without risking, particularly serious repercussions. So I'm sure that's probably what was going on in the minds of those pilots and their commanders. This is a way of saying, we are here. You may be here, but so are we. And that is part, isn't it, about in terms of the conflict. I mean, it is worth saying, I think, that these intercepts do happen pretty regularly. That's what we're told, particularly over the Black Sea since the war began. They do happen in other areas as well, but they don't usually end up with actual physical contact between the assets.
Mm-hmm. Can we read anything into the way the Americans are handling this and how quickly they came out and the sort of language they used in that Pentagon statement and press conference, I think he gave?
They're still gathering information at the moment, clearly. They are, interestingly, suggesting that they may release some images. I don't know if that'll be stills or video of what took place. They're going through a process of looking at what they can release. That could happen in the next few hours, and that may possibly give us some more indication about who's telling the truth here about the nature of the incident. But I think they wanted to get it out there that this was something they regarded as an escalation, but their response has been pretty measured. They haven't particularly jumped up and down about it, but they've wanted to tell the world, look, this is what the Russian Air Force are doing.
That was the BBC's Gary O'Donoghue in Washington, D.C. Well, a short time ago, I also spoke to our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, to get the latest on what Moscow is saying about this collision.
The Russians have a rather different story. So Russia says, the Russian Defense Ministry says, that it did scramble fighter jets after detecting an American unmanned aerial vehicle over the Black Sea. But Moscow says that this MQ-9 Reaper drone had been flying with its transponders off in the direction of Russia's border. It maintains the drone had violated the boundaries of what it called the temporary airspace regime that Russia had established after the invasion of Ukraine. And it insists that the jets did not come into contact with the American drone. The story, as far as Russia is concerned, is that the unmanned aircraft sort of spun out of control, lost altitude, and crashed into the sea.
So we heard earlier about the fact that these sort of interactions, not collisions, but sort of interactions, are happening fairly frequently over the Black Sea at the moment. I don't know whether we know where this collision actually took place, but it's not going to do anything to ease tensions between Washington and Moscow at the moment, is it?
No, of course. I mean, it adds to the tension, doesn't it? Interestingly, the Russian statement was kind of matter of fact. It didn't accuse America of anything. The language was quite controlled, I would say. I think that one of the key question here is, was this a mistake, by the Russians? Did a Russian pilot get a bit too close for comfort when they were trying to kind of buzz the drone? Or was this deliberate? Was this Russia upping the ante and increasing the pressure? Was this a conscious escalation? We don't know that yet. If it was a mistake, then things, I think, can be calmed down after this. But obviously, Washington is furious at what happened. We know that the Russian ambassador in the US has been summoned. So America's making it quite clear that this is outrageous, this is reckless on the part of the Russians, which of course Moscow denies.
Human rights activists around the world often live with the threat of imprisonment or violence, but few have as tough a time as those in Russia. One of them, Svetlana Ganushkina, has been presented with the Anna Politkovskaya Award in London for her work protecting the rights of refugees and migrants in Russia. She was a friend and colleague of Ms. Politkovskaya, who was killed in Moscow in 2006. Svetlana Ganushkina came into the NewsHour studio today and she told me how she's been helping thousands of Ukrainian refugees who have found themselves in Russia as a result of the war.
Первое, что я должна была бы сказать, это что most people are not coming on their own will. They're coming because they don't have any other choice. A lot of people come because they have relatives in Russia and people who can support them. Unfortunately, Russian propaganda plays a great role in that. It managed to persuade people who come from Ukraine. You cannot consider a move on your own will if you don't have any other choices. That's a very important point to make.
Других вариантов нет.
Mm-hmm. And how are you helping them? What are you able to do to support these people?
Те, кто приезжает к нам, это обычные люди.
People who we are helping are absolutely ordinary people and they need everything that normal people would need.
Mm-hmm.
People who we are helping, they don't have any other means of existence, they don't have any funds, they need place to live, they need money, they need accommodation, they need their kids to go to schools. These are things that we're trying to tackle. I was surprised to find out that in the temporary centers for Ukrainian people, not that many people live. It's about 40,000 out of 2 million who came to Russia. People who stay with their relatives, they also need a great amount of support because people who they stay with, they cannot support them for a very long time. I would like to emphasize that people who would like to leave Russia, they can do it. And they can leave to Europe. Because we now have a great volunteer movement in Russia who help people to settle in Russia or to leave Russia to Europe if they wish so. And I'm very, very pleased to see this society, this movement growing, because it proves that we have civil society in Russia.
У нас все-таки есть гражданское общество.
At the beginning of the war, we did see quite a lot of Russian people taking to the streets and demonstrating against this war. We haven't seen so much of that since. Maybe many of those people were arrested, maybe many of them have left the country, maybe some of them have been sent to the war. And I know it's really difficult for Russian people to talk about openly how they feel about this war. Is there anything you'd be able to tell us about that?
Ну, разумеется, уличная активность стала меньше.
Obviously, there are much less of street protests. My colleague Oleg Orlov was out protest, and he was fined for more and more each time. I also was detained, and I paid 10,000 rubles. But some people were treated much more brutally than me. I'm now a foreign agent myself. Though nobody can clearly explain me for whom I'm spying. I strongly believe that interviews I'm giving, and in these interviews I call war, but not special military operation, I believe they would have much more impact than me going out on the street. Sometimes people approach me on the street and they tell me that they share my values and views. One of the people was a woman who said, there are many of us who think like me, and I want you to know that. It was very important for me to hear that from her.
Для меня важно услышать.
So you have been an activist and a human rights defender for decades through some very difficult times in Russia. And it is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, probably, having that role in a country like Russia at the moment. You mentioned Anna Politkovskaya, who was a friend of yours, who was killed, and there have been others. What keeps you going, and are you not scared for your own safety?
Да, сейчас, пожалуй, самое тяжелое время.
We are in one of the most difficult times you can imagine, because nobody can imagine the biggest nonsense than this bloodthirsty war between Russia and Ukraine. Anna was killed, and the first woman who got this award, Natasha Istimirova, also member of our memorial group, also was 3 years later. About fear, it's more on a physiological level. It's difficult to say, difficult. The most important sense is, despite everything that is happening and despite all the nonsense, despite of the sense of responsibility for this war and even for Putin, however you look at it, we voted for him. We are doing something that takes us on the truth and good side of life. And it's very important to have this inner belief.
Это то, что дает право жить.
So I want to ask you, you were born in World War II, and the history of Russia since then has hardly got any less dramatic than it was in World War II, really. But for people across the world that are listening to this, what would you like them to think of your country and of Russian people? Because there has been quite a lot of anti-Russian feeling all over the world because of this war. But you're here, you're a Russian, and how would you like people to think of your countrymen?
Тяжелый вопрос сегодня, когда Россия...
It's very disappointing that because of this war, Russia loses its rights to celebrate its victory in the Second World War. I want to tell people, please don't give up. We are not hopeless. I understand that Russian Empire is a very big historical temptation because any empire will fall apart eventually. Well, in that respect, Britain is luckier because it's on the island. You can easily understand where is Britain, England, and where is its colonies. But where are Russia's borders? Where are we going? Question concerns me a lot. We need historical Einstein to solve this puzzle.
Который бы решил эту проблему.
You're heading back to Moscow in a couple of days. How do you feel about that?
Чувства у меня очень простые. Я возвращаюсь.
I'm going home to my work, which I never stopped even here. I know this is a place where I am needed. There's not any other place where I could be doing what I'm doing.
И где бы я знала, что я должна делать.
Veteran Russian human rights activist Svetlana Ganushkina speaking through a translator to us earlier. And that's it for this edition from me and the whole team here in London.
Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, described it as the biggest defence deal in his country's history. Standing in a naval base in San Diego, President Biden said the three countries' partnership, known as AUKUS, would boost international security.
AUKUS has one overriding objective: to enhance the stability of the Indo-Pacific amid rapidly shifting global dynamics. This first project is only beginning. More partnerships, more potential, more peace and security in the region lies ahead. Simply stated, we're putting ourselves in the strongest possible position to navigate the challenges of today and tomorrow together.
Our correspondent Will Grant is in San Diego and told us the key details of this deal.
Well, the most significant part to come out of it is undoubtedly this agreement over the nuclear-propelled submarines going to Australia, 3 from the US, as well as a major new development in terms of the building something called SSN AUKUS, a new submarine, a new class of submarine, a nuclear-propelled submarine to be built in Barrow-in-Furness in the United Kingdom. It brings with it a whole series of other elements, the training of submariners and so on for Australia with the US and the UK, and also a rotational force of submarines working off Western Australia. All of it very interesting, very kind of significant really in terms of a post-Cold War multilateral defence agreement. I think it was being billed as really the biggest of its kind in generations, as it was put by Prime Minister Sunak. But I think as well it was clear that all of the leaders were at pains to underline that these are nuclear-powered submarines, but they will not be carrying nuclear weapons. They will not be nuclear armed. And that was clearly a message for Beijing.
And what about China's response?
Well, as I say, that element, I think, being directed to Beijing, because already we know that they are furious, in a sense, about the very existence of this pact. They've called it extremely irresponsible when the alliance was first announced, saying it demonstrates a Cold War mentality among the 3 member states, and accused them of undermining nuclear non-proliferation agreements, to which, of course, Australia is a signatory. But certainly the Australian Prime Minister was also at pains to underline that they have no intention of changing their position on its nuclear armament, that they are a member of the Non-Proliferation Pact, that it is not a nuclear nation, but that these nuclear-powered submarines are going to be an important part of its naval fleet.
Will Grant in San Diego. It was the largest failure of a bank since the financial crisis of 2008, and President Biden has moved swiftly to calm fears after the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank last week. On Sunday, a New York-based bank, Signature, also closed. In a televised address from the White House, the US leader said anyone who had deposits in either bank would have their money protected, and that he would do whatever is needed to maintain financial stability. But his words didn't seem to prevent some unease on the US stock markets. Our North America business correspondent Michelle Fleury in New York is following the situation.
It's fascinating to watch. You know, the main 3 indexes here are all trading in positive territory or pretty much flat right now. But it has been a very choppy day. And if you are looking specifically at bank stocks, and even more specifically at regional banking shares, they have been struggling and under a great amount of pressure. One name keeps cropping up again and again, First Republic, its shares down more than 60%, but it certainly has not been the only one. And I think one of the things worth remembering here is that what the government did over the weekend here in America is they bailed out customers. They did not bail out the bank. And so investors are still nervously looking at banks where there are huge amounts of uninsured deposits, wondering who might be vulnerable next and where they might lose money.
Well, what is the worst case scenario? Is that banks go down like dominoes?
I mean, I think you've already seen 3 banks in the space of a week. They are smaller, so it's very different from what we saw and experienced in 2008 in the global financial crisis. I think worst case scenario is that you start to, as you say, see more dominoes fall. That is less likely this time round, though, in part because the bigger banks are much more diversified. They don't face the same kind of challenges. You know, and again, what we've seen is not just the government guaranteeing those deposits, but also the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, acting as the lender of last resort. So in this case, they've set up an emergency lending fund to try and address the real problem here, which was assets that have lost money as a result of rising interest rates that were sitting on these banks' balance sheets. And when they had to sell them because customers were withdrawing their money and they needed to raise more cash, they suffered a loss. This lending service should address that problem, and so that should help try and kind of stem the contagion and restore financial stability, but we're not there yet.
Michelle Fleury. So why is the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, the 16th largest in America, affecting stock markets in countries like the UK, France and Germany? I asked our international business correspondent Theo Leggett.
The general picture is that if there are fears about the health of the banking sector, then those fears are almost by definition international, because the banking sector is international. Now, when it comes to the UK, here in the UK, we did have a subsidiary of SV Bank that fed money to British startup technology companies. And although that was a separate subsidiary, there were deep concerns that it would be unable to cope with demand for deposits to be returned. So the British government did actually have to engineer a takeover by HSBC Bank, which happened today. That company was sold for the token price of £1 in order to safeguard deposits that were kept there. But the big picture is there is anxiety at the moment about the health of the banking sector. Those anxieties cross borders.
So how dangerous is this, do you think, for global financial stability?
Well, you have to look at the psychological aspect here. What happens with banks is quite often there's an area of concern. What we saw with SV Bank was that it had been caught out by investing too much money in bonds which lost value just at the time when a lot of depositors were asking for their money back, and it couldn't cope. Now, it was making losses, it was trying to raise money, and people saw that there were problems at the bank and rushed to withdraw their deposits. And it's that rush to withdraw deposits, called a bank run, which can take a bank out of business. So if people think there is a problem at a bank, they can very rapidly create one. And the issue that the banking sector as a whole is facing at the moment is anxiety. Nobody's quite sure where the next problem is going to come from. The issues at Silicon Valley Bank appeared almost out of the blue, and they blew up into something big very, very quickly. So now people are asking themselves, well, what about other banks? What assets are other banks holding that could cause a problem in an environment of rising interest rates? Are banks the areas we want to invest in at the moment? And a lot of people are clearly thinking probably not, because we've seen the share prices of banks around the world fall sharply. I mean, just to give you some examples, Santander down 7%, Deutsche Bank down more than 5%. So the results of that climate of anxiety are what we're seeing on the markets today.